fear plays a natural and very important role in our lives. It's because we fear that we won't go and put our hand over the fire and expect not to suffer the consequences of it. And when we understand the mechanism of fear and the reasons why we fear, we can much more easily mitigate the risks that cause us to fear in the first place, and that will help us to control our own fear in the wilderness as well as that of other people. So in this video, I'm going to share with you a few tips and tricks on how to manage your own fear and that of other people if you're in the wilderness, whether it be in a survival situation or just out camping and outside of your normal circumstances. I'm Clarice, welcome to the Live Ready channel. So when we fear something, it's our brain telling us that there is a risk, or at least a perceived risk to us in the environment that we find ourselves in. And just because you have a feeling of fear doesn't mean that feeling is reasonable. And it also doesn't mean that that feeling isn't there. So if you are, for example, in the bush with someone else who has a fear of being alone in the wilderness, just because that person doesn't necessarily have reason to fear in that moment doesn't mean they don't feel that way. So try to be sensitive in that regard, to especially if you're with someone else in the wilderness. Fear plays a role in helping us to self-preserve. If we didn't have fear, we wouldn't stay away from a fire and we might end up burning ourselves. Speaking of which, let's get a fire going here quickly so we can have dinner. There we go. Anyway, so consider that the fear that you have or someone else has plays a role. There's a reason why we fear in the first place, and it doesn't necessarily mean that that's a reasonable fear. So those are two things to consider first off. If there is someone with you who is really afraid of being alone in the bush, it's because their background tells them that this is an unfamiliar place where there are certain risks. You'd be quite right in saying that there are certain risks in being alone in the bush. So when we fear, it's our mind telling us that there is a threat, perceived threat. It doesn't necessarily have to be a real threat, but it can be perceived, and try to respect other people's fear. That is what a natural accelerant fire looks like, by the way, if you didn't know. And if you have never in your life felt scared by being alone in the wilderness, and some people don't, there are people who just are not afraid of being scared in the wilderness. The first time I was out wild camping, I had no fear whatsoever. I think sometimes fear comes with a bit of wisdom, and then also the wisdom eventually overcomes the fear because you learn how to mitigate the risks around the fear. But if you have never been fearful being alone in the wilderness, then stick around, because you might at some point find yourself out in the wilderness with someone who is actually afraid, and being able to help that person overcome their fear is going to make the stay in the bush a lot more comfortable for you as well. It can be difficult being around someone who's panicky, and you constantly have to show them, listen, it's not so bad. What are you afraid of? Let's talk about your fears, So talk to people as well. Say, it doesn't help. We turn around and we get lost in the opposite direction for 6 hours, because that doesn't improve our situation. So what can we do to make this situation better? Turning around is not going to do it. Right, so now that we've gotten down to why we fear, how can we actually manage to control our own fears? Well, first of all, if you fear something and you're not in immediate danger, like your life is not in immediate danger, why not take a step back, sit down, take a deep breath, and go, okay, what am I fearing? What is it that could possibly happen? And a good question to ask yourself is, what is the reasonable worst thing that can happen? So I read something interesting in psychology a couple years back that said that we people in general have a tendency to awfulize. And what that means is you think about the absolute worst circumstances that you might find yourself in, and you even worse than that, you almost romanticize the badness of that imagined situation. So for example, you might be out in the bush. Yeah, there are leopards out here. Yeah, there are, I don't know, there's not a lot of people around here. I'm quite isolated where I am. But maybe someone stumbles upon my camp. So there is reasonable risk in me being alone in the bush, especially a woman alone. I'm sure that there's 100 poachers who'd love to relieve me of my camera equipment. So there is risk, but that's reasonable risk. Awfulizing that situation is imagining the boogie monster is coming for me, or Bigfoot is coming for me when it gets dark. That would be awfulizing it, or imagining an unrealistic worst case scenario. Now, it's good to ask yourself what's the worst thing that can happen, because it makes it reasonable in your mind. This is the worst thing that can happen. That means that you can plan for the worst case scenario. The minute that you can plan for the worst case scenario, you can then go, okay, how do I mitigate this risk? For me, it was always a question of who am I going to run into while I'm alone in the wilderness? And the best thing that I could do was to learn how to track so that I can be certain that there aren't tracks of anything or anyone else that regularly visits the area. So that might be a leopard, it might be a poacher, it might be, I don't know, just someone who's wandering through the bush. And opportunistic theft is a risk, especially for me being out here alone. So I don't want to be around other people. I want to be isolated, which is why I learned how to track, because it was one way that I could mitigate risks. Another thing that's a risk for me is injury while I'm alone. So maybe I'm setting up a top shelter and I'm trying to get over the rocks here, and I trip and I fall and I hit my head. Now, if nobody's expecting me home because there's no one waiting for me, then I might lie here for 2 days before somebody finds me, or I wake up, or something like that happens. And here nobody is actually going to find me. So a reasonable thing to do to mitigate that risk would then be to send someone a message with a pin location and say, I should be here until tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. I should be back in the village by, 10 o'clock or whatever. If you don't hear from me by that time, or somewhere in the interim, you should come find me, and send along a pin location. So that would be a reasonable way to mitigate the risk of injury or some bodily harm coming to me and nobody finding me. But there are other things as well, and people have a fear of snakes, or they have a fear of the unknown, of the dark. I remember the first couple of times, actually I think the first time I slept out at a wild camp, I had no fear at all. I think the fear came later with a bit of wisdom of what the risks actually are. And having later on realized how much can actually go wrong, you start to also perceive the elements and the dark as more of a threat. So I think there's a bit of wisdom that developed over the years. And I got to a point where I couldn't sleep when I was out in the bush. I was just constantly worrying about some animal raiding the camp, which is a reasonable fear, but it's not something that you should really fear. But it just kept me up at night. So those are all reasonable things that can happen. And when you think about them, then they might actually cause you to be alarmed, or not have a good night's sleep. But in any case, think about the things that can possibly go wrong. How bad can it really be? If an animal raids your camp, so what? Clean it up in the morning. It's not the worst thing that can happen to you. Or take your cooking fire elsewhere and make a cooking fire elsewhere. Put your fire in front of your shelter so that the animals are less likely to come into your shelter, because they don't like fire. Animals have an inclination and natural resistance to fire. They tend to stay away from it, I think, except for rhinos who like to stomp on fires. So if you've got the time, take a step back, take a deep breath. And this can be hard when you've got other people around as well. So I've been out in the bush. We got horribly lost here in the mountains with a group of people. And at one point, people started to panic so much just because we'd been out for much longer than we had intended to be. We had no resources because none of us were prepared. We were supposed to be out for an hour and a half, just moving horses between farms. And in the process of moving these horses, we got horribly lost because the people who had said that they knew the way didn't know the way. And it just also teaches you to go ahead and do your own preparation. Don't always just rely on other people, which is a lesson I learned that time. And the result was that people started panicking after a couple of hours. And we did actually have reason to worry, but the panic made it so much worse, because then people started turning around going, well, we're going back. Back where? Getting lost in the opposite direction. Going back doesn't help you. So that's when people start making stupid decisions, is when they panic. So if your life isn't in immediate danger, sit down, have a cup of pine needle tea or something like that, and just think to yourself, okay, what's the worst thing that can happen? Take stock of the situation. What's wrong? Are we lost? Can we call for help? Do we have, contact to the outside world? If so, then make contact with the outside world. So you start to problem solve as you go. So your fear is there for a reason. So engage that fear. The same way I said in my video about stress and loneliness, engage the feeling. And if you know that you're going to get fearful being out in the bush, then expect that. Expect that at some point I'm going to feel like I'm really scared, and that's going to be okay. It's going to be fun. Even if I feel like that, it doesn't mean that I'm really in grave danger. It just means that I'm going to feel that way. And once you get that feeling, you're already prepared for it. How I ended up getting myself used to being alone in the wilderness is just doing short day trips. Just do short overnighters, and even if an overnighter is too much for you, then just do a hike out into the bush, and once you get to a certain point on the hike, sit down for a bit, have a cup of tea, just appreciate the beauty of nature, just appreciate all of the positivity around you, not so much just the negativity. Because if all you ever do when you're out in the bush is think about the negative things, then you are going to end up feeling negative about everything. So sit down and appreciate the normal natural beauty of the area and the environment around you, and just do as much as you can. And if after an hour of sitting around drinking tea on the mountain, you feel like, okay, I've had enough of this now, I can't handle any more, then go home. And in that way, you can systematically get yourself used to being out in the wilderness and just being alone by yourself and appreciating the things that happen around you. If it helps, go somewhere that is sort of controlled, like a nature reserve where the rangers know where you are. So for me, if I go wild camping by myself, usually if I'm wild camping, I'll be either on a farm, a private farm where the owners know where I am, or reception of the nature reserve knows where I am, and it sort of reasonably mitigates the risk of me being alone. Or I'll take a friend with me, someone who can just keep an eye out while I'm busy filming. I've said it before, when I'm filming, my entire focus actually ends up being on the cameras. So I don't actually have a whole lot of situational awareness, which is bad. So in order to mitigate the risks of being alone, I'll have some measure of control in place to ensure that I'm okay, Failing that, I do actually sometimes get scared. There have been some strange occurrences. I've been out walking really far into the bush looking for a campsite and stumbled upon mortars and some really weird bins containing really weird liquid. And I just thought to myself, where am I now? There's not even a road anywhere near where I was. So it must have been something that was abandoned there. And I've heard some stories about it since. I've been up in the mountains at the weirdest abandoned buildings, and all of these things, they bring all these weird situations and scenarios to mind, and you kind of wonder to yourself, well, where have I come to now? And if anybody comes here, what kind of person is that person going to be? Who am I going to meet around here? And it's okay to feel like maybe you're not where you should be right then, and it's okay to be scared then as well. So as with overcoming stress and loneliness, the first thing to do is just know that you're going to feel scared at some point. And when that feeling comes, engage it, know, okay, well, you know what, I'm scared for a reason. This is a natural reaction of my mind, of my psychology. And then once you've engaged that feeling, step out of it. Sit down either and have a good think about why you're feeling scared, what the actual risk is, and is there a way to mitigate that risk? And then you can also just systematically make yourself used to being alone in the wilderness. A good exercise in psychology for yourself, if you are having a hard time, just bringing your mind under control in that moment where you step away and sit down and try to calm yourself down, is to talk to God about it. Philippians 4 verse 6 says, don't be anxious about anything. Bring everything to God. Submit your thoughts to God as well. There's another scripture there. I can't remember what the reference was. But don't be anxious about everything. Pray about everything instead. And it really does calm you down. Sit down, have a conversation with God. Say, this is how I feel. Can you please calm me down? Bring your peace over me. And you will feel a whole lot more peaceful after you've done that. So it's kind of a process of desensitization. You go out on a day hike, sit down, have a cup of tea. Next time, go out, sit down, have a nap. Next time you go out, sit down, take a few pictures, have a nap, have a cup of tea, and then maybe do an overnighter for the first time with someone who's really experienced in wild camping, and that can just help you to become at ease with being alone in the bush. Anyway, if you found value here, remember to hit like and subscribe. Follow me on social media. I put a lot of the everyday live ready stuff on Instagram, and special thanks to my Patreon fans. These videos are absolutely possible because of you guys. And until the next time, live ready.